Welcome to What the F is Going On in Latin America and the Caribbean, Code Pink's weekly YouTube program of hot news out of the region. In partnership, we have a lot of partners now, I'm so happy to say, in partnership with Common Frontiers, Council on Hemispheric Affairs, Friends of Latin America, Massachusetts Peace Action, and Task Force on the Americas. We broadcast weekly at 4:30 p.m. Pacific, 7:30 p.m. Eastern on Code Pink's YouTube channel. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Telegram, and now on radindiemedia.com. Today's episode is Ecuador, the Lasso government post-national strike. So today's episode is a follow-up to our June 22nd episode entitled Ecuador Erupts Against Neoliberalism, in which we were joined by Camila Escalante of Kawsachun News. So today, our guest, and I'm so happy to welcome him back, and I'm sure many of you will recognize him. Today, our guest is author and journalist Joe Emersberger. You can find his work published at Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, and be sure to read his book, Extraordinary Threat, The U.S. Empire, the Media, and 20 Years of Coup Attempts in Venezuela. So welcome, Joe. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me. I just want a quick note, the book I wrote is with my my friend Justin Poder. We wrote it together, so just want to clarify.
Oh yes, okay. A shout out to Justin, sorry.
No problem.
I remember when it came out, and I apologize.
No problem. Oh, that's okay. That's okay.
So for our audience, what we want to talk about in this episode is what's happened since June 22nd. I think most of the audience is probably aware that a week ago Tuesday, there was an attempt to impeach President Lasso of Ecuador. That process failed by only 12 votes. And a week following that impeachment attempt, 4 ministers have resigned in the Lasso cabinet or Lasso government. And so let's talk about what those 2 specific events, I mean, they're right on the heels of this 18-day national paro. And so what has happened? I think before we went live, you started to tell me that this is, you know, a pretty significant achievement of the indigenous community. So maybe we should start there, but it isn't only the indigenous community.
No, it's not. First, yeah, but it was definitely, there's no disputing that this was spearheaded by CONAI. The 18 days of protest was spearheaded by CONAI, by the leadership, by the lower level leadership, organizers, activists of the CONAI movement. They spearheaded really an unprecedented national strike protests, you know, and Lasso's, President Lasso's Freudian slip there. President Lasso's approval in the polls, all the polls have him around 20%. He has fallen precipitously in only a year since he's taken office. He's the continuation of Moreno. He always was. But it's important to note that they were already in 2019. It's important to stress this because October 19, there were already huge protests against neoliberal policies, and that was before the pandemic strike. Because since 2017, there's been at least a 35% increase in poverty and a more than doubling of the homicide rate, violent crime in Ecuador since 2017, or it's continuously gotten worse since the right-wing governments took over. And that's a huge story there. But when I say it's a huge achievement of these protests, what's impressive is that the concessions they have officially rung from the Lasso government are concessions that resonate with the entire Ecuadorian population, or the vast majority of Ecuadorians, because they include like declaring a national emergency in the health sector, right? That affects everybody. That's not the indigenous, just the indigenous communities. It's calling for it, and one of their demands, they didn't make it into the concessions from Lasso, but they also stressed that the violent crime, that was one of their 10 points, that there has to be something done about the just skyrocketing homicide and violence in the streets. Common crime has just exploded. And
And the drug trafficking has, that's
well,
relatively.
it's linked together. It's a dramatic increase in violent crime that's just exploded since 2017.
And it's
And
related a lot to unemployment and the poverty that creates, yes, or.
yeah, it's linked together, but it's not that simple, because what happened was there was a total restructure of the judicial system under Moreno. Okay, and this was done with the with the collaboration of CONAI initially for the first few years, because there's divisions between let's say the left-leaning movements of voters in Ecuador. That split has exacerbated under Moreno for a lot of reasons. But I want to stress, first of all, that what the concessions that CONAI wrung from the government are, like I say, they resonate with the general population, because they weren't just about the indigenous sector or the rural sector. They focused on things that impact the entire Ecuadorian population. And Lasso is just extremely unpopular because the general situation in Ecuador has just gotten worse. And the pandemic made it even more so. Something like 6 months into the pandemic, Ecuador had like one of the worst death rates in the world. I mean, entire world. When you looked at excess deaths compared to the pre-pandemic period, so it was just an utter disaster all the way around. On top of the disaster that was already taking place and that already caused such commotion. So there was so that it's considered a huge achievement that they managed to ring these concessions and ring them in such a way that, like I said, they resonate with everybody. However, Lasso just recently is already saying that the protests were financed by Correa's movement and by drug traffickers. He's saying that about the protest. Now he's just made concessions, he's in the dialogue, and yet he's going out publicly and saying, oh, they were all financed by drug traffickers and of course attacking Correa, because that's the big demon in Ecuadorian politics. The so-called Correaist movement has the largest bloc in the National Assembly. You mentioned, I want to stress right off the bat, you mentioned right off the bat there was an attempt to impeach Lasso. It's not like an impeachment. If you remember what happened with Dilma Rousseff, the legislators threw her out basically and then seized power for themselves, right? Well, that's not what was being attempted in the vote that just took place. What took place in Ecuador is something that was instituted in the 2008 Constitution when it was ratified by voters, and it's called. They refer to it informally as muerte cruzada. I guess that means like mutually assured destruction, because what happens is that if the National Assembly, what they can do is they can terminate his term, but they have to go to elections for the entire National Assembly and the president. Okay, so it's for fresh elections for everybody, not just for the.
Okay.
So it's not like the Dilma Rousseff
For the executive and the legislature.
Yes. It's not like what happened with Dilma Rousseff, where basically the right-wing legislatures can just throw her out and seize power for themselves, and they stayed in power for 2 years, right? That's not what this was about. This was about forcing elections within 6 months for everybody. Okay, so what happens is Lasso can run again, and if Lasso were to win, he would be able to finish out his term, and they could not invoke this muerte cruzada again, because it only applies for the term. So, and the reason, and similarly, the president also, like a popular president is confronted with protests led by an unpopular minority or whatever, he could call out, say, you know what? Okay, fresh elections then. I'm gonna go to the voters, and you guys all go to the voters too. So there's Article 148 allows the president to force this muerte cruzada, to force elections for everybody. Okay, and Article 130 allows the National Assembly with a 2/3 vote, which they didn't quite get.
Which they didn't get. Yeah,
they fell short
of that.
Yeah, they fell short. But if they had got their 2/3 vote of the legislative vote, they would have forced new elections for everybody. Okay, so, and this was implemented because between the period 1996 to 2006, Ecuador had, depending how you count them, 9 to 11 different presidents because of all sorts of discontent. It was just a disaster. And throughout this period, you had rising poverty and again, rising violent crime, all the way from the 1980s, all the way to basically all the way right up until, if you look at the homicide rate for Ecuador, basically from 1980 all the way through till 2011, until the very early years of Correa's government, when he instituted reforms to the judiciary, into the legal system, the violent crime rate is constantly increasing. I mean, I can just tell you myself, as a young kid, I could walk the streets in the 70s, early 80s with my uncles in downtown Guayaquil, no fear of being assaulted or anything, right? By 1990, my family, my relatives in Guayaquil, they didn't want to go in their own neighborhood after dark. It just continually got worse and worse and worse. And under Correa's government, in only 10 years, from 2000, by the time he left office, the homicide rate had fallen by 2/3. Just a dramatic decrease in crime all over the country, and a dramatic improvement in the general feeling of security. And along with that, a reduction in poverty. And if you remember, I mean, this is more, it's not just there's not just a simple correlation between poverty alleviation and violent crime reduction, because if you remember it, under Chavez, even during his best years, the Venezuelan government still struggled with the rising crime rate, because what Correa's government did is they unclogged the legal system. So many cases that were just sitting in limbo, so many people not being processed. There's no resources dedicated to just making the system function effectively. And they implemented a different kind of way of selecting judges and prosecutors through a process that kind of bypassed political parties. I mean, you could criticize it for a lot of reasons, but the results are undisputable. It produced a much more efficient and much more effective legal system that produced these tremendous results. But since 2017, when the right-wing government, the neoliberal governments took over, part of what they've done is just merged or eliminated public sector services and employees. So there just isn't just not the resources to deal with what resources they have dedicated basically to trying to throw Correa and his supporters in jail. I mean, Jorge Glass, the former vice president, is still in jail. Correa, if he went to Ecuador, would be in jail. He's been sentenced. He has asylum now in Belgium.
Some of my neighbors here in Mexico City would be as well if they returned home.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just it's been a disaster. And so there were these tremendous achievements under Correa's time in office. They've been completely undone, and we're going back almost to what Ecuador was in the 90s. So with this tremendous, like I said, in the 96 to 2006, this tremendous violent crime and instability, there was so much also political instability, governments changing constantly. And so that's why this muerte cruzada that I talked about was implemented, because it would say, okay, there's got to be a better way. If the government really falls in popularity, there's got to be a better way than just taking to the streets to get rid of them. There's got to be a constitutional way that forces the whole political class to be accountable, because the legislature and the president both have to go to elections. Okay, so I just think that's an important point to stress.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's much more complex and
and also
could be
now
really fantastic, but could be quite disastrous too, depending on who calls for it.
Yeah, sure, but the whole political class has to go, right? So it has to go to elections. They have to go to the voters. Yeah. So that is a well thought out mechanism. And there's also right now, unfortunately, there was an attempt made after that vote failed. There was an attempt made to present to the CNE recall referendum. Right? They want, okay, give us petitions. We want to start collecting signatures to force a recall referendum on Guillermo Lasso, but that was shot down. The CNE said they didn't provide enough proof, that they have to justify their attempt for a recall, saying that Lasso didn't fulfill his promises. They say they didn't give enough proof. It's kind of comical for the CNE to even bring that up, because Lasso's candidacy in 2021 was actually illegal. I mean, it's very clear that the Pandora Papers revelation show that he had, through his family, assets in tax havens, which under Ecuadorian law, you're not supposed to have if you're a candidate. You're supposed to get rid of any property in tax havens before you can be a candidate. He didn't do that, but with the restructuring of all the authorities that's been happening since 2017, it just didn't bite him legally. And now we see how the CNEs, even after these unprecedented protests and an extremely unpopular president, he's still being protected from the CNE from a recall referendum. So,
So
but
for
they're going
our
to keep.
audience, the CNE is the Consejo Nacional Electoral, the National Electoral Council, which is
Right.
a branch of the government
Yes.
and oversees the electoral process in Ecuador, not unlike other countries. The INE here in Mexico, which is under
Right.
scrutiny, and the CNE in Venezuela, same name.
Yeah. So that's what's going on right now. Is that and also there's also against Leonidas Issa. He's the leader of the CONAI. It's I think important to stress that when these protests initiated, first thing the government did was try to arrest him. Well, they didn't arrest him.
They did, yeah.
Yeah. And then, but they were backtracked on that right away. Because like I said, CONAI is not their one strength CONAI has. It's not as much of a top-down organization as say as Correa's movement is. Like I support Correa's movement, but when you have a more horizontal structure, that has advantages sometimes, because you can't just decapitate the leaders and everything goes away.
Right.
Like when an electoral movement is dependent on so much on a leader, well, you cancel out the leader one way or another, and everything kind of falls apart. But they couldn't do that with this protest, because it had such genuine grassroots support. They just grabbing the leader was just going to, I think they realized, just going to throw fuel on the fire, so they backtracked. But they're still trying to go. They still have court cases against them, and Lasso's already linking the protest to narco traffic and to correísmo, which to his supporters, who are very powerful, that's just the same thing, right? Correísmo and narco, that's the same thing, and you saw the same discourse against Evo Morales. And the people who hate the people who hate Evo Morales or any left-wing government, they're narcos, they're criminals. so the fact that he's engaging that discourse, that certainly puts a cloud on whether these agreement that he reached with CONAI will actually get implemented. So it's kind of it's a scary situation in a way, because if he's not going to implement the agreement, and the CNE and other authorities are going to block him from facing a recall, and the legislature is going to block him from having the muerte cruzada option, that it's like they're closing all the legal options, right? And so that's a recipe for perhaps even more national strikes or protests down the road. But it's not something that it's very uncertain.
Let's talk about, well, now there's two things, just listening to you outline all of this. Let's talk about the things that the government has. I have a short list here. Maybe we should just run through them. There were the 10 items that CONAI and the protesters at large were demanding be addressed, and what the result is as of today, as far as we know. And then also, I think it's really important that we talk a bit about social movements and organization from the ground up, and how important that is in affecting a government's response to the needs and desires of the people. I think that is one of the biggest successes, is just not just where the government has agreed, to acquiesce or implement solutions, but this tremendous success of community, social, and labor organizing. And that is something this keeps coming up, throughout so many of our episodes, that this push against neoliberalism, this neoliberal model that Lasso is a poster child for, this ground up organizing, how important it is. And CONAI has affected the removal of 2 presidents already in the 90s and the early 2000s. Yes, that they've had that much.
Yeah, it's true, but it's also, there was at that time, in the 90s, there was also divisions within the right wing that facilitated presidents being removed. Correa has really put the fear of God in them. Their fear of the Correa is coming back in some way, or somebody very loyal to Correa coming back, has put such fear in them that now they really close ranks. So it's not like the 1990s in that sense, because 1990s, they never really had something like a Correa to look back to say, whoa, if we don't close ranks, we're going to end up with him or with them, right?
Yeah,
Now they do. They have this fear of Correa coming back, of the Correa's movement coming back in power, and so that's a huge fear. And so that's why, like, technically, supposedly, Guillermo Lasso's wing of the right-wing political class, and Jaime Nebot, that's another leader based in Guayaquil. Those guys are supposedly at odds, right? They're bickering. But when it came down to the vote in the National Assembly, it didn't matter. They were not going to allow him to get thrown out. So that's a major difference with the 1990s period. Back then the political class would turn on each other much more. For any reason. Yeah, so it's good. Moreno, as unpopular as he was in single digits by the time he left, but he finished his term. And so I'm not guaranteeing Lasso's going to finish his term. I'm just saying they have this fear of a left-wing movement, electoral movement that is successful, that has a track record, that has achievements, and they haven't been able to destroy it. Despite it's the largest bloc in the National Assembly. It's not a majority, but it's the largest bloc. So
like 35% of the country still supports Correísmo.
Well,
that's a pretty solid.
Yeah, I think it's probably higher than that if they actually. But he isn't allowed to run. I mean, they rushed.
No.
They rushed through. They did really ridiculous things too, just to show you the fear. They didn't. Not only do they not allow him to run, not only do they still have Jorge Glass in jail for now going on 5 years, but they didn't, during the campaign, they didn't even let Andres Arauz and his team use Correa's image in the campaign. Yeah. So they said, well, if Correa's sentenced, therefore his image also is not allowed to use. So his image loses political rights as well, not just the man. But it was also very cynical, because there was a party that Moreno's old party that used to be Correa's, that had almost zero support, and they actually got away with using Correa's image, and that the only impact that could have is maybe to confuse voters to inadvertently vote for them, thinking they're voting for somebody Correa supports, but they allowed them to do it in their TV spots. And it's like the only reason you would allow that is to cause confusion, and the hope that maybe in a very close vote, that could potentially have an impact, because if a vote is very close, any little thing can potentially be swayed. So there's all sorts of dirty tricks that are going on all the time. But yeah, that's a big difference. So that's why I wouldn't bet on Lasso being thrown out. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but this is not like the 96 to 2000.
What they achieved in the. Well, let's talk about what these protests have achieved, because here I'm just going to quickly go through and please comment.
Sure.
I'm just going to do an abbreviated run through for the audience to show what has been agreed upon. So the government says that fuel prices have already been frozen and will not increase in the future. Regarding bank debts, the government responds that it has arranged for Ban Ecuador to forgive all credits up to $3,000. At the request of a policy of fair prices for basic agricultural products, the government offers to negotiate with the private sector. The government does not respond to the request to increase public investment to generate employment. The government does not respond to the request for a moratorium on extractive mining and the oil border. I'm not sure, that's probably not the correct interpretation from Spanish to English, but it's really important for us to understand that extractive mining and particularly the oil extraction does affect indigenous communities the most.
Yes,
they're the largest population affected by the extraction industry. The request that collective rights be respected. The government doubled the budget for intercultural bilingual education. But that would mean also investing in the public education system, which they don't seem to have done. Right. There will be no privatization of the strategic sectors, but the promise remains in the air because the government is because the country is facing a government that accelerated the application of neoliberalism.
Yeah.
the request to establish a policy to control prices and curb speculation. The national government pushed that to the state level or the provincial level. I forget what you refer to them in Ecuador. They pushed that to the governors and mayors. And a state of emergency has been declared for the public health system and urgent purchases of medicines. There is no answer about the policies for admission to the universities offered by Lasso when he was a presidential candidate.
Right. But yeah, that's but you can see right away is that, and also there's been an increase in the subsidy for the poor, like basically there's a bono de desarrollo humano, right? These basic subsidy given to the poorest people has been increased a little bit. So, but you can see right off the bat that these are demands that impact the entire population. Even the thing like the limiting prices or price gouging or whatnot for agricultural products, that also obviously that reverberates to
throughout the entire population.
Yeah.
Anybody who buys food.
Yeah, right. So that was the key thing about these demands, that it's the situation in Ecuador is deteriorated to the point where the movement, the indigenous movement can articulate demands and fight for demands that are supported by everybody, right? So that's a key. That's a similarity with the 1990s. That is similar now that we're back in a neoliberal regime now for 5 years. So that similarity holds. But the other factors I mentioned are also a factor. And the thing about extractivism, I'd like to comment on that, because that's where that goes to some of the divisions between let's say the Kanai movement and Correa, because Correa had a bad relationship with Kanai for most of his time in office. And some of that was like, there's a right wing, let's face it, there's a right wing element to Kanai. Like there are people affiliated with Kanai, and certainly their electoral, it's not officially the electoral movement of Kanai, but it's the Pachacutic is the electoral wing of the indigenous movement. And if you read even Leonidas Isa's interview, and they ask him about Pachacutic, it's pretty obvious that that's kind of an embarrassment to them because they've been so reactionary.
We saw that last year's presidential election.
Sure. And we also just consider the fact that this Muerte Cruzada vote that I talked about, this was brought in by Correa's movement, the UNES bloc. And it was actually, people were actually very pleasantly surprised that most of the Pachacutic went along with it, even though some of them abstained, including the president of the National Assembly. But it was a pleasant surprise that they went along with. In fact, most of them did vote for that. I mean, the vast majority voted in favor of this Muerte Cruzada fresh election mechanism. But it's still, the fact that it even comes as a surprise. I mean, the fact that even a guy like the head of Kanai is basically, they've always, for years, kind of almost a lot of times had to distance themselves from Pachacutic. So there's been issues there. But the issue with extractivism is that, as you mentioned, the extractive industries tend to operate in indigenous communities, and traditionally they've tended to get stuck with the pollution, with the garbage, the toxic waste, and the wealth flows elsewhere. You know, the wealth flows into the pockets of multinationals and into the pockets of the elite in Ecuador, and maybe the urban, more urban based middle class, or whatever you want to call it. So that's been a problem, but it's very hard to address that in a country where you also desperately need foreign exchange just to do basic development. I mean, just to pay salaries, just to build roads, just to do sanitation and all the basic infrastructure that Ecuador doesn't have is still developed under Correa, but is by no means finished. So that's a tension there. It's very, I mean, the only way you could actually eliminate that tension is just not to do extractive industries at all. But then you've committed, if you go that far, you've committed political suicide. You just won't.
And economic suicide. I mean, you can't just come off of that economic model overnight.
Yeah, but I want to make this point, because I put this on Twitter, but I want people to consider this. Like Correa had when he was in office, he had this initiative where because there was he wanted to, there was a proposal to expand drilling in the Yasuni National Park. And he said, look, okay, I don't want to do this, but I'm going to do it unless the international community can pony up like it was a little under $4 billion, right? Because with that money, they could put that in some kind of
right, that trust that
right,
he attempted
right.
to create.
Yeah. Remember, that's $4 billion. Now keep that in mind, $4 billion, and that's several years ago. Now in May, without even thinking, the U.S. Congress unanimously pushed through this, or close to unanimous. No, that wasn't unanimous, because actually it was embarrassingly, it was the right wing who had some resistance, but the squad and all those people approved $40 billion for the proxy war in Ukraine, right? So I mean, you can shower that kind of money on a proxy war with Russia, but what Korea was asking for, not just from the U.S. but from the wealthiest countries, is say, okay, $4 billion. They got nowhere near that, because it's the climate crisis. Everything is global. If you want countries like Ecuador, desperately poor, to bypass extractive industries, well, then the just thing to do is to pressure the richest countries, the former colonial countries,
exactly,
to replace the revenue stream that would allow them to bypass those industries, to develop other without doing them, right? Well, so that's a very important point, because I looked at World Bank data. The $40 billion, that's equivalent to Ecuador's oil rents for the entire 2014 to 2020 period inclusive. So that's like a 7-year period. So oil rents is, the World Bank defines that as the total value of production minus the production costs. So that gives you an idea, just over a 7-year period, just that one little gift, $40 billion gift to the proxy war with Russia. Yeah, that covers Ecuador's major
oil in the ground.
Yeah, for a 7-year period. And right now, even if you think about right now, their oil exports this year, because prices are very high, they're going to be like $10-12 billion, something like that, in that neighborhood. So again, that's like only a quarter of what that one disbursement to the proxy war with Russia amounted to. So it's just something to think about, because when you it's to me really offensive when especially environmentalists in the global north want to look down on governments, especially governments that are out, because they'll always have this dilemma of doing some kind of extractivism, because like I said, the only way you could alleviate this tension entirely is to not do it, but they just cannot afford that. That's just not
pay to keep it in the ground.
Right.
Yeah, have that offset. You talk about the U.S. funding of the proxy war in Ukraine. Here in Mexico, the president of Mexico said something very, very similar, that a pinch of that money could have been invested south of the border to alleviate the need for, some of the root causes of migration to the United States. And just a drop in the bucket of those funds financing the proxy war. So it's
right.
The colonial nations and the control of global capital just really sets the agenda, unfortunately.
Right. Yes.
Can we talk about well, there's two things I'm thinking with. You mentioned the Ecuadorian oil exports. Has that in any way been affected by the U.S. sanctions on Russia? I mean, who customers selling to established customers, shipping, has any of that been affected?
Well, global oil prices have spiked since the war in Ukraine.
Yes.
Yeah, so that alone, it's an international market for oil, right? So that's definitely boosted Ecuador's oil prices. However, there's a very important thing that I don't think gets commented on, is that under Correa, the Ecuador's share of the oil revenues increased dramatically, also because he renegotiated the contracts with the multinationals. And one of the things that then the right-wing governments afterwards, under Moreno and then Lasso, have been doing is gone in the other direction. So that's why, if you think about it, why is there so much unrest and tension with such high oil prices? Why isn't Lasso just able to just
Invest
smooth
in the
things,
people.
smooth
Do the
things over,
Chavez thing.
or just directly subsidize, just smooth things over, right, with money.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
one reason he's limited doing that is because his policy has been to just give more of that money to the multinationals.
Right.
So that limits his, even if he wants to, that limits his options for doing things. The other thing is that in 2020, he entered an agreement with the IMF. And it's the typical structural adjustment agreements that during the 90s, again, that's a major factor in the unrest that we had in that 96 to 2006 period, when you had this constant, revolving chairs of presidents. So you're back to that as well, with the IMF telling you what you can and can't do, and again tying your hands. And they did other things. They under Moreno, they instituted policy such that the government is limited in the way it can even use its own resources, like from its own central bank. Like Ecuador has the U.S. dollar. So you could say, well, why does it even have a central bank? Because one of the main things that the central bank does is issue currency. But the central bank in Ecuador does function like a bank, and it does still play an important role. And under Correa's government, that was a way they could move money around within the government, right? To not rely so heavily on private financing. So now obviously the big banking interests, they don't want that, right? They don't want the government. They want the government to go to them, right? So that's another key change. So all these what all these things do, and then there's the tax giveaways and everything else. What all these things do is that gives less money to the government so that they can smooth over the social problems, right? So that limits that. So
it kind of financially starves off all the state infrastructure and institutions.
Who was that guy who said starve the beast? Stockman, right? The old Reagan era guy. Yeah, that was his.
Yes.
Yeah, that's kind of the philosophy. Starve the beast, starve the government so that it can't do anything, or pretends it can't do anything, and then
it all gets privatized.
Yeah, and then you have all these problems, and you have all this social explosion, because in a poor country like this, you're really, the suffering we're talking about here, it's because people are really suffering, and they feel that they have no option but to take to the streets.
So what do you see in our last few minutes here? There's so much that we can talk about. What do you see potentially happening? And I guess I asked this in the context, specifically of what we saw in Colombia a year ago, and the national strike there, which I did go and work as a human rights observer at late May of last year. And I will just share with the audience, it is one of the reasons I was not allowed into Colombia to witness or to serve as an election observer for the presidential elections in May, because of what we did witness in May, June of last year during the Paro Nacional in Colombia. And we've seen, so we've got a really, really recent, not just historical experience in Colombia, but we have a next door neighbor to Ecuador now that, has changed its government. How much, that's all up to the Colombian people, how much is going to be able to happen, with this new administration coming in. It'll probably take multiple administrations to implement the changes needed. But here's this next door neighbor experience a year ago that's led to a change in the government. Is something like that possible in Ecuador, given the vast majority of Ecuadorian citizens are affected by this horrible economic policy, compounded with COVID, compounded now with this global, crisis with sanctions on Russia? It's really
right. Well, I want to say a lot depends on the CNE. A lot depends on the state prosecutor, because the state prosecutor as soon as the CNE shut down the recall referendum, there was talk about impeaching members of the CNE, and the state prosecutor, Procurador General, right, he came down with a ruling that said the CNE members can't be impeached by the National Assembly because they're organizing elections for 2023. so which is, just on its face, a ridiculous excuse, right? 2020, we're halfway through 2022.
You got 6 months or more.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah, if they're that, so a lot depends on how stubborn those kind of people are in the government. It depends if they can finally, some of them can start breaking away and start issuing rulings that make sense, and make this a democratic and let the democratic mechanism settle this, as opposed to forcing people into the streets. Because what other option do you? Just sit there and suffer quietly, or
Yeah.
you're going to take the street. So what I'm hoping is that eventually either members of the CNE or different members of this apparatus, state apparatus that's protecting Lasso, that they cave, just like they caved when they allowed Rouse's candidacy in 2021.
Right.
That was not a done deal until the last minute. They really barely got through. They almost didn't allow, just think of that. They didn't allow the movement that has the largest bloc in the National Assembly, that won the national, they almost didn't allow them to participate. So, but
And they did amazingly well.
Yes.
Given that late start that they were.
Yes, they did.
Yes.
But it just shows you
amazingly well under extraordinarily difficult.
So the resolution of all these problems, I think, depends on whether these institutions can finally stop protecting Lasso and start looking to let voters decide this, as opposed to some kind of trial of strength on the streets. I mean, not that can't be legitimate when there's no other option, but there are mechanisms to resolve this now through voting. So those should be done, but hopefully they won't keep blocking them, because that's what they're doing. They're blocking the mechanisms that should resolve this through electoral means.
And so next year, 2023, are legislative elections and regional, or?
Yeah, they're like local elections.
Okay.
Like local level elections. Yeah, mayors, in fact. Mayors.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Municipal.
Yeah. So we'll see what happens there. But that's what I think. I can't give a prediction, but I think if people can stop blocking the democratic route, then hopefully there'll be a way out of this that'll be less disastrous. Put a break on all these trend that's been going on since 2017. It's just been horrendous.
It's very well, I mean, it's very sad for the people, but it's also just, it's just one more example of the failure of neoliberalism and how violently imposed it is.
Yeah, you can never underestimate the level of violence and dishonesty that resort to. I think leftists do sometimes underestimate what they're up against. I think even Correa's movement underestimated what he was up against. Underestimated the number of opportunists and that he had within his ranks. I guess that's another thing that hurt them, was that Moreno was trouble, but he came from their movement, right?
Yes.
So that also damaged their credibility. Is even though they fought him from as soon as he showed what he was, they immediately fought against it. But still, that undermines people's confidence in your leadership.
Exactly.
So yeah, you can never underestimate what you're up against, and the ability of opportunistic elements to get in, weasel their way into your movement. And especially when you have this global North colossus that's always got its hands in there with NGOs, with through the CIA and everything else. So
all that money that we U.S. citizens could have reinvested in ourselves.
Yeah, I remember
much less our neighbors as well.
In 1964, I don't know if you've heard of Philip Beatty, right? The first big whistleblower of all time. He, the CIA whistleblower. His book Inside the Company talks a lot about Ecuador, because that's where he was based. And he said that in 1964, he said with a $50,000 per year budget, he said the CIA said, well, we're not controlling things, but we're pretty much giving everything a big push in the way we want to do it, right? The way we want things to go. So that's a big factor too.
Well, Joe, I'm so thankful for your time this evening. I know it's a Friday night, and I'm just so thankful that you could join us again. I always love working with you, and I hope that we can have you back as we watch things unfold in Ecuador. I think it's going to be really, really important, especially now with these elections next year, to really watch, because we're just seeing so much unfold throughout the hemisphere of the Americas, including your country and mine.
Right.
Maybe not rapidly enough, but or maybe for my country kind of disastrously, but there are so many changes coming, and what we're seeing in Ecuador is not unlike what has been happening, you know, over the years
Sure.
throughout the hemisphere. So it's going to be really important to watch Ecuador, and I look forward to having you come back and talk more with us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
Oh, no, thank you so much. And I
Alright.
just want to thank our audience for listening and watching, and be sure to check us out next week. We broadcast typically every Wednesday on Code Pink YouTube Live. In this case, Joe was so gracious to join us this evening, and we wanted to accommodate his availability. But you can catch us generally Wednesday nights on Code Pink YouTube Live, and be sure to catch Code Pink Radio every Thursday, 11 a.m. Eastern on WBAI out of New York City and WPFW out of Washington, D.C. Both projects can also be found on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And so we look forward to talking with all of you next week. And again, thank you so much, Joe. I really appreciate your time. And it's always great. You're always so insightful.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nice to be with you. Take care. Okay.